Hello class, and welcome to our Chapter 2 lecture. Today we're going to be discussing how probation has developed, looking at its past and present. So first let's go over our learning objectives. The learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to recall the social and legal history of probation in England and the United States, to discuss the founders of probation, restate how supervision philosophies have changed in the U.S., describe how probation is now organized and operates, examine how Community Corrections Acts help implement community supervision programs, as well as characterize how probation supervision styles have changed over time. So let's look at the precursors to American probation. We first have to start with early legal practice in the United States, which was distinct from British common law. So British common law used punishment and retribution, things like flogging, branding, mutilation, and corporal punishment. So in the U.S., we formed amercements, security, and motions to quash as forms to avoid these harsh punishments and penalties. So an amercement is a monetary payment that's arbitrarily ordered by the court for any offense, and the idea is that this will help bring justice by making the offender accountable through monetary payment. The only issue with this is that it's arbitrarily ordered by the court, meaning that there is no rhyme or reason to who is given a certain amount depending on the offense. It's just ordered willy-nilly, if you will, by the court. Security then is where we get the idea of bonding out or being released on your own recognizance. So this is a bond or recognizance either before or after conviction, where the defendant promises good behavior and then they're allowed to go free pending their next hearing. That's security. Now a motion to quash is a little different. This is either an oral or a written request to the court to either repeal, nullify, or overturn a decision during or after a trial. So very important to remember, security is before or after conviction, whereas a motion to quash is either during or after a trial. And this is typically, the motion to quash is typically based on minor technical errors that occur during the trial. So to understand the different procedures that we have in modern probation, we need to understand two cases. The first is Commonwealth v. Chase in 1831. So in this case, this is where we get having a suspended sentence and being laid on file. So in this case, the defendant was released with the sentence being laid on file or set aside, so long as she didn't get arrested again. However, she was again arrested, and the first sentence was then imposed. So here, having a suspended sentence, the sentence is neither dismissed nor is a final judgment given. It's simply set aside, laid on file. So this actually came to be used with minors and young offenders in Massachusetts to prevent them from having a conviction and giving them the opportunity to do better and engage in positive behaviors rather than delinquent behaviors, so that they wouldn't have to have a sentence for just one mistake they made. Then we come to the Killets case in 1916. So in this case, the judge refused to vacate a suspended sentence. So the defendant had a suspended sentence, it was just hanging out. The judge refused to vacate it, even though the victim no longer wished to press charges. The outcome of this case is that the U.S. Supreme Court held that federal courts did not have the power to suspend indefinitely the imposition or execution of a sentence. So essentially, the federal courts cannot simply set a sentence aside and do nothing with it. There needs to be some outcome for that case eventually. You either need to dismiss it or you need to impose a sentence if they violate the conditions of that. Something has to be done. You can't have a sentence set aside and then 10 years later you commit a new offense and now you're serving a sentence for that 10-year-old case. So who founded probation? Well, we have two main gentlemen that we want to talk about, John Augustus and Matthew Davenport Hill. So in the beginning, probation officers were not paid. They were volunteers and philanthropists. of which John Augustus was. So he actually had a shoemaking business, and he's considered the founder or sometimes the father of probation. He would allow his house to be used as a refuge for drunkards and had been known to pay up to $30 a person for bail. That equates to almost $650 today. He was known to pay the fines and costs for indigent defendants, so indigent meaning that they just don't have the funds. And he actually went out of business. His shoemaking business went out because of his philanthropy work. He was spending so much money. He was also a member of the Washington Total Abstinence Society, and this society abstained from alcohol. However, they also believed that we needed to treat alcoholics with kindness and understanding. So this society would come out and interview first-time offenders and actually bail them out of jail if they determined that they were likely to change their behaviors and return to court. Hill then actually laid the foundation for probation in England, and he fought for equality for everyone. So he worked to end the transportation of convicts to Australia. That's how England would handle some of their convicts. They would simply ship them off to Australia, which is interesting because there's videos out there, and I'll see if I can find one to post for you, where it talks about how Australia was pretty much built off of a bunch of convicts. So he also kept records of offenders' behaviors, including their reconviction rates. So these are the earliest records we have of looking at recidivism. Now we need to talk about how probation has developed, of who was responsible for probation supervision. Starting in 1928, Massachusetts sanctified its first probation officer by statute, and they were paid. So it was actually a police officer that was paid to be a probation officer. So it was under the police. We then transferred the responsibility over to the prison commissioners. However, because of a lot of corruption that was happening in the prison system, we determined that it couldn't be a police officer. So it was someone under the prison commission. Then it transferred to a statewide transfer of power to the courts in 1891. So now probation is under the courts, so we're actually considered officers of the court rather than law enforcement officers. So we're enforcing a court order and court rules and regulations, not the law. We'll get into more of that later. So how did federal probation develop? Well, historically, federal judges resisted probation legislation. So federal probation was actually established through the National Probation Act of 1925. They averaged one probation officer for every 400 offenders. Don't know about you, but there is no way I could see 400 offenders in 1 month's time, which is typically the rate that you would see offenders. High-risk offenders you'll see more frequently, but that's about the average. So from 1930 to 1940, the Federal Bureau of Prisons operated the federal probation system. In 1940, this moved to be under the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. Because there was a dramatic increase in caseload size, the Federal Bureau of Prisons couldn't handle all of the prisoners, as well as all of those being placed on probation. So in 1984, we have the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, and this actually abolished federal parole, and all prison releases are now under probation supervision. So let me be clear, we still have parole. So parole is still after you're incarcerated. Probation is in lieu of incarceration. However, we abolished federal parole, so probation officers serve in the capacity of supervising those on parole and those on probation supervision. To be a candidate, to be a federal probation officer, they would like you to be over the age of 25, preferably between 30 and 45, because they want you to be mature. You'll notice our chart on the right here has a couple different characteristics that they look for in a probation officer candidate. You also have to have a bachelor's degree and at least 2 years of experience in social work. And you may find that interesting that they want social work. However, you'll see later on in this chapter how a big part of probation today is essentially case management. We're not here just in the justice model anymore, where we're just simply imposing punishments and penalties. We're actually trying to make offenders make better choices. Help them make better choices. So they need you to be energetic, as well as patient. You have to, one, have the energy for these offenders, because I will tell you, they will run you all over creation, and you have to be patient with them. There are reasons they have deficits in certain areas. We'll talk about criminogenic needs. These deficits are why they're committing crimes, and we need to help them improve their social skills and their positive activities to be able to ensure that they're not going to commit crimes. You also need to be intelligent and have good moral character. You actually sign as a probation officer. It's a code of conduct that says you're going to abide by all of these different codes of conduct, and good moral character is one of them. You can't be out there, drinking heavy, posting all over social media, acting a fool, basically, and expect to be considered for a probation officer. They want to see that you conduct and compose yourself in a professional manner, and that you can be a good example for these offenders to look up to. So what is the purpose of probation? Its main purpose is to assist in reducing the incidence and impact of crime by probationers in the community. Pretty simple. So to do that, probation officers provide pre-sentence investigation reports and actually conduct pre-sentence investigations to write those reports, which is what you all will be doing for your midterm paper. There's more instructions on that in D2L. We also develop dispositions. So let me go back. A pre-sentence investigation is where you're going to meet with the offender, get a whole case history, a whole summary on that offender's life, looking at education, employment, family history, housing, financial stability, everything about that offender we want to know. And then you write a report based off of that interview to develop a disposition for the judge to say, this is what the sentence for this offender should be based off of all of these factors. And then probation also supervises offenders. So we have these offenders from start to finish. Probation handles every step of the way. You also provide programming. So you'll either provide services directly to the offender, such as skill building. You may actually sit there and help an offender fill out an interview, or teach them how to have a tough conversation. So you can either provide the services directly, or you'll be connecting offenders with services and programs in the community. You can offer victim restitution as one of them, where the offender will be ordered to pay a certain monetary amount to make the victim whole, or victim mediation, where the victim and offender will meet together and come to a resolution for the case. And we'll talk about both of those in later chapters in more detail. It's also to further fair and individualized justice. So we understand that offenders have rights, and every offender needs to be incarcerated. Some offenders can be treated within the community. And on top of that, looking at parole, because it is very similar to how probation supervision is conducted, it's important to realize that some offenders can be treated in their communities, and we need to give them that opportunity. So we want to make sure we're protecting the community through supervision of these offenders, but also providing them services to reduce their criminal behaviors. So there's a few purposes of probation. We have 3 different categories. We're going to look at the purpose of probation for society, for the offender, and for the victim. For society, it's to protect the innocent from personal and property harm, and also to ensure we have safer communities. So through probation, we use supervision, we use monitoring, we use meetings with the offender, again, those services and programs to help protect society. For the offender, it's a fair and individualized due process. It gives them the opportunity to change their behavior, again, in their communities. They can have minimal intervention if necessary. Doesn't mean, again, not every offender needs to be incarcerated, so we can look at minimal interventions. Does the offender only need to be seen once a month? Does the offender need to be seen twice a month because we need to drug test them more often? You have different levels that you can have within probation. It's not every offender gets the same status quo supervision. And then finally, diversion. We can actually divert offenders from prison systems through probation, so they can serve their entire sentence in the community, being able to be a productive member, working, going to school, providing for their families, and not spending time in prisons costing the taxpayers loads of money. And for the victim, we want to protect the victims. We want to protect potential victims, but we also want to restore victims. Now, I know I used this terminology earlier of making the victim whole through restitution. And when I say that, that's typically the only place that we use the terms making the victim whole is when we talk about restitution, because it's really the only aspect that you can fully make that victim, you can fully compensate that victim. And by that I mean, if you've ever been the victim of a crime, you know that you can only be restored to a certain degree. You will never be whole again. You will never be the exact same person that you were before that crime happened. Maybe some will, but most won't. There's still a part of you that is affected by that crime. Say you were robbed on the street. You may now be leery every time you walk down that street. Whether you know it or not, you may get a little anxiety when you walk down that certain street. Things like that. So we like to use the terms of, rather than making the victim whole, of just restoring harm that was done to the victim. Because again, you can only restore a victim to a certain degree. So let's jump into a little bit of juvenile court and juvenile probation, because it is important to discuss juvenile offenders as we talk about probation as a whole. So the history of juvenile probation, starting in the 1700s to the early 1800s, children were typically just disciplined by their parents and others within the community. It was a community effort to make sure that juveniles were doing what they needed to do and not getting in trouble. So children often worked during these time frames to contribute to the family's income. And at this point, we had no place for orphaned youth to go. So if they had no family, there was no place for us to put them. From 1817 to the 1840s, we had houses of refuge pop up. They were these child savers, they were called. They built these houses of refuge to provide a family environment for runaway and neglected children. Unfortunately, some of those children ended up being abused and exploited in these houses of refuge. So the New York Children's Aid Society actually started shipping kids to farmers in the West to prevent them from going to these houses of refuge because they were that bad. In 1890, the Children's Aid Society of Pennsylvania started to offer to place delinquent youth in foster homes. So while foster homes previously were for runaway, neglected children, more of the dependent children, they started offering to place delinquent children, so those with criminal histories. So this was considered placing out, is what it was called. And then we come to 1899, which this is important. 1899, the first juvenile court was created in Cook County, Illinois. So it was based on reform and treatment, again, rather than punishment and retribution as the adult criminal system was. And then in 1938, we had the Federal Juvenile Delinquency Act, which provided probation supervision for all youth under the age of 18 in the U.S. Lucy Flower is the individual responsible for helping create the juvenile justice system in Illinois. She actually drafted and passed the legislation that provided for the separate court as well as a separate detention system for juveniles, separate from the adult. So we had this idea of the doctrine of parens patriae. So this idea was thought that the child's behavior was a product of a poor social environment and the family's background. So under this idea, crime was not the child's fault. It was the parents. It was their environment. It was their upbringing. So there were 4 principles under the doctrine of parens patriae. First is that the court appointed a guardian for every juvenile for their best interests, that the parents were actually held responsible for the child's behavior. They believed that jail was inappropriate for youth. They should never be placed there with adult offenders. And at all costs, avoid placing out. So avoid taking youth out of their communities and out of their homes. If at all, you can do that. And I will say that idea and ideology shifted in, say, the 1980s, 1990s. However, we are back to that now. At all costs, our numbers are down in juvenile placement facilities. The idea now is keep them in their communities, teach them how to behave and act accordingly, within their community, because we find that when we pull them out, they can act very well. Some of them don't, still get it. But most of them, you put them in a separate place, you give them so much structure, guidance, they're getting a lot of treatment. They don't leave that one little campus. They do well. However, when you pull them back to their communities, where all of those triggers and their stressors and their home and family environment are, that was some of the basis for their offending, they're not able to do quite as well, and they revert to their criminal behaviors. So what did early probation legislation look like in other states? So New York's probation law actually allowed police officers to be probation officers. However, other states did not allow police officers to serve as probation. So many early probation workers were volunteers because a lot of the new laws did not fund any salaried positions. Remember, I said most of them were volunteers. So the idea was that legislation for probation would not have passed if they were paid positions. So they were mostly paid, if at all, through private donations, or probation officers were actually other municipal workers who just took on probation cases in addition to their regular job. Now I say municipal, so you think of any of your other county workers. Potentially your waste management could have probation cases. It was any other municipal worker. So what are your thoughts on probation officers not being paid? And what do you think this says about the early justice system that we had in place? Just want you to think about that as we continue along. So probation today. As I've said before, probation can be a sentence in and of itself. Probation's a sentence. Parole is after incarceration. So we have diversion or deferred adjudication, which is typically used with juveniles, first-time felon offenders, misdemeanor offenders, or those with mental health issues. So the idea with diversion is that we want the offender to avoid a criminal label and the stigma, as well as the collateral consequences that can result from a criminal conviction. We'll talk about collateral consequences in another chapter. However, this typically requires that the offender complete some type of treatment or counseling to be able to be considered successful with that diversion program. Youth can actually be given a civil citation directly by a police officer, and typically if they admit to their offense, they're allowed and they're eligible for diversion. If they don't admit to the offense and their guilt, then the case typically gets processed to the intake department at probation, where the process continues for the courts. So probation departments can actually be considered under county or state, and it's different for every state, and it's even different in the counties. So let me explain. The county or state, it depends largely on budgeting factors, whether the probation is under the county jurisdiction or under state jurisdiction. Some probation departments include juvenile and adult probation under the same department. There are some that have, say, 1 or 2 juvenile probation officers to handle all of the juvenile cases. Some probation departments are controlled by the executive branch, and some are controlled by the judicial branch. There's a chart in your book that shows this as well. So in Pennsylvania, adult probation is either state or county controlled, depending where you are in the state. It can be under the executive or the judicial branch. And in some cases, your probation and your parole departments are combined. Juvenile is always county controlled, however, in Pennsylvania. We are always under the judicial branch. I say we because I'm in juvenile probation. We're under the judicial branch, so we are officers of the court. And in some cases, our juvenile and adult probation departments are combined. So the Community Corrections Act, I know we're switching gears a little bit here, but the Community Corrections Act is a contractual agreement that assures county governments receive state funding to support the programs that they need for their probationers. So speaking to the previous slide, how some departments are county controlled, this ensures that those counties are receiving state funding to support programs they need specific to their county. So it actually incentivized counties to keep felons on probation and keep them out of prison because they would receive more money the more offenders they had. Do we think this is ethical or a SMART decision as far as community safety and protection are concerned. So this also, however, positively allows counties to develop programs that are specific to their offender populations. We know not every county is the same, not every city is the same. So some cities may have huge drug problems. Some may have huge mental health issues. So it allows those counties to develop programs specific to their offender populations. You may have a drug court in one or a mental health court in another. Maybe victim-offender dialogue meetings are very important to that community, where in other communities they don't see each other as very neighborly with one another and they don't really interact with one another, so victim-offender mediation would not be very successful. Those are just some examples. So how have our community supervision models changed over time? Well, let's begin with the casework model from 1900s through the 1970s. We're going to cover each of these individually on the next slides. Then we go into the brokerage of services model from 1971 to about 1981. The justice model, again, was big around the 1980s up until 2000. And then from early 2000 to present, as well as from then 2012 to present, we have the neighborhood-based supervision model, as well as the criminogenic needs-based model. So we sort of combine these two models in our work that we do today. So the casework model. This viewed probation officers as agents of change. They were there to provide therapeutic services to the offenders, and the idea was that they should be creating therapeutic relationships with their probationers. Again, casework. Think of a caseworker. Then the brokerage of services model said, no, probation officers are not agents of change. Instead, they need to be maintaining relationships with their communities and with agencies within the communities so that they can refer probationers to different community services that are available out there. So they're brokering those services to the offenders rather than providing those services to them. So they used within this model the community resource management team model, where each probation officer had a specialty area, whether that was drugs, mental health, and then they would team up together on an offender's case. Instead of having one probation officer, you would have a team of probation officers. Say you had co-occurring illnesses, maybe you had a mental health disorder that you were treating with drugs instead of proper medication management. They would team up on your case and then refer you out to different services within the community to address those issues. So then the justice model, we really switched gears here in the 1980s. There was an escalation in violent juvenile crime. There's just an escalation in crime in general. Drugs, crack cocaine came out. So even in the adult world, we saw increases in violent crimes. So the justice model used an escalating system of sanctions. So they said that the sanctions should correspond to the social harm that resulted from the offense, as well as looking at the offender's culpability in that offense. So what level of responsibility did they have? So the penalties here would graduate in severity as well as duration according to the seriousness of the crime. So we know that probation was looked at as a separate and distinct sanction here, and they favored monitoring of court orders and court-ordered conditions, as well as depriving offenders of their liberties as a means to control them and to control crime. So they felt that counseling and simple surveillance and reporting did little to reduce recidivism, and they wanted to assist the offenders in complying with their probation conditions. So they brokered, similarly to the brokerage of services model, they used treatment services through other social service agencies. The important part here is that probation was not the one referring these offenders to those services. They looked at the other social service agencies like the mental health system to make sure that offender was getting the help that they needed, that it wasn't probation's responsibility. Probation's responsibility was simply to make sure that we were sanctioning the offender. Okay, so now we use the neighborhood-based supervision model. So this is where offenders are supervised according to their zip code. This is how we work in my county. So when I was on the street as a probation officer, I was assigned to the Norristown area. So it included Norristown, Lower Marion, Upper Marion. It was a broader range, but it was about an hour, I would say, radius, because it was more densely populated. There are other probation officers that could be assigned to larger areas, just depending on caseload sizes. In your more rural areas, you don't have quite as many offenders, so they may have, again, a larger geographical area to supervise. However, in large cities, like, say, Philadelphia, they would actually be supervised according to the zip code, so literally the neighborhood. Because you know that in some cities, even neighborhoods can vary from a couple blocks from one another on what they find important. So the idea here was to have community visibility of the probation officers. So they were out on the streets. They were out there in the neighborhoods talking to the offenders, getting to know the other community members, and basically immersing themselves in that community and in that neighborhood. They were viewed as boundary spanners. So boundary spanners on the street in the way that they were spanning the connection between the corrections system, police, treatment providers, and even faith-based practitioners. So they were looking at all different aspects of the community to help treat the offender. Again, it's important that they understood the community-specific needs, so they need to understand what values and beliefs does that community hold near and dear to their heart. What desires do they have for their community? What do they want to see happen? And looking at the community leaders and looking to them, as well as faith-based leaders, to help provide community-specific safety. So having those leaders explain to the probation officer, this is what our community finds important, and having those leaders help you help the community. It's also important here that these probation officers are able to identify locations and establishments that are known to have crime and deviant behavior around them. You need to know which corners do they typically sell drugs on, so that if I'm out seeing my offender and I see him down on that corner, I can tell him that's probably not the best place for you to be, and I don't want to see you down there. I know I did the same thing with my offenders. I would ask them, oh, where were you yesterday? Oh, I was down in the courts. Okay, which courts were you down on? Because I know what happens down on those basketball courts after hours when it gets dark. Nothing good. So you also need to, in the same turn, identify legitimate opportunities for that offender in the community. So you need to identify opportunities where they could recidivate that are known to have crime, but also then identify opportunities where you can find them jobs. You can maybe find them housing. Find positive things for them to do. Again, with juveniles, it's very important that we fill in their after-school time, so we would find places, recreation centers for them to go, to give them positive things to do. So now we come into the criminogenic needs-based supervision model, and you will hear criminogenic needs and be sick of hearing it from me by the end of the semester. So this is how we now classify, supervise, and treat offenders. So the idea here is that we want to establish meaningful professional relationships with our clients. We want to help the offender complete their court-ordered conditions, so their community service, paying their restitution. However, we also want to make sure that we are matching them with appropriate services. So we're doing a lot more of case management. If you take a look at Table 2.2 in your book, for me it's on page 38, it shows you a lot of different tasks that probation officers are now responsible for, going from rehabilitation-oriented functions to law enforcement functions. Even though I know I said we're not law enforcement officers, there's still those types of functions that we're responsible for that are considered law enforcement based. Investigations. They say arresting offenders. In juvenile, we detain offenders. Being a peace officer, making recommendation sentences to the judge. So there's a lot of things that we do. Take a look at that and see the differences from what it was in 1992 and how it's changed up through 2015. So we also emphasize MI, or motivational interviewing. So in this way, you want to ask open-ended questions to your offender. You don't want to simply ask them yes or no. You want to be okay with having quiet time. If you ask a question and it takes them a little bit to give you an answer, sit in the silence for a minute. You'd be surprised how many offenders will just start talking then, but they're expecting you to talk at them, which is why motivational interviewing works so well to get them to open up. Because you're not talking at them, you're working with them and getting them to describe to you what they want to do to change. So you'll also be reviewing motivational interviewing throughout this week's module. This is how I want you to approach your pre-sentence investigation that you complete. It's very important that you ask there are some that need to be closed-ended questions, but for the most part, ask open-ended. Give them time to give you more details for whatever question it is that you're asking. So it's about building that relationship with the offender, and you want to get them to engage in what we call change talk. Rather than me saying, Johnny, your drug test was positive this week, that's not good, I really need you to stop using drugs, you need to stop doing that. He's going to look at me and say, okay, Miss Brianna, great, that was really helpful, as if I don't know that. Instead, I could say, hey, Johnny, I could say, hey, Johnny, why do you think it's important to not do drugs anymore? Could you explain that to me? Why would it be important for you not to do drugs? Why would it be important for you not to have a positive drug test? So you want to ask him those open-ended questions. Get him to engage in change talk. Get him to tell you why it's important that he not do drugs. Get him to tell you how the drugs are impacting his life. So, Johnny, in what ways are doing drugs negatively affecting you in your life right now? Get him to say why he should stop. So we have this dual role relationship, or this dual role that probation officers play here. So not only are we a therapeutic change agent, but we're also an enforcer. And you'll see that again in table 2.2. So let's look at the characteristics of who's on probation. 75% of adult probationers are male. Women have actually increased from 21% in 1995 to 25% of the probation population in 2015. So women population is increasing. Probation was the direct imposition for that offender sentence in over 50% of cases. 77% of probationers are actively reporting, and we'll get into what non-reporting probation is, but just for right now, know that. And 9% of offenders were given a split sentence. So a split sentence is where the offender spends a very short time in jail, followed by a longer period of supervision. Looking at race and ethnicity, the majority of offenders are white, over half. 13% are Latino. Roughly 30% are black. 1% are representing American Indian, as well as 1% representing Asian or Pacific Islander. Now looking at the offense type and the most serious offense. So over the last 30 years, felony probationers have more lengthy criminal histories and more serious convictions. 50% of those have had at least one prior conviction, and of those who have had a prior conviction, 1/4 were convicted of a violent crime. So we're seeing a growth in the range of 25 to 44 years of age of the of the probation population growing, but we're seeing a decline in probation populations from the ages of 18 to 24, which is interesting. So you'll see offense type on the left here. The majority of offenses are felonies, while 41% represent your misdemeanors. So in sum, the precursors to probation include security, laying on file, and suspension of sentence. Prisons and suspensions of sentences were not accomplishing reform, so we have this idea of probation. John Augustus is considered the founder or father of probation, and the first juvenile court was established in Illinois in 1899. Lucy Flower was the individual responsible for helping create that and pass that legislation. Diversion focuses on voluntary contractual agreements So the juvenile again, or the adult, has to admit to their crime and their guilt to be eligible for diversion. Probation and parole can be combined in departments, as well as adult and juvenile probation departments can be combined. Lastly, there are varied approaches to community supervision, but currently we're using the neighborhood-based supervision model as well as the criminogenic needs-based model. So that was your Chapter 2 lecture. And again, I will post a PDF of it for you to be able to follow along.